Hey, everybody. My name is Vikram Aiyer. Thank you for being here. I want to start with a quick story. We're going to start with a round of introductions, but I just want to start with a quick story that I was thinking about in the context of today's conversation. When I was 8 years old, 9 years old, I remember living in LA, and I was playing Power Rangers. I don't know if anyone remembers that TV show with neighbors. And it was just casual after school play, nothing too serious about it. But anytime we had to divvy up who get to play which Power Ranger, the color allocation went probably in a direction you would assume, where myself or my other friend, who happened to be Chinese American, Stephen Wu, we would always get assigned the Yellow Ranger or the Black Ranger. And it seemed benign, commonplace, wasn't even something I thought about too much as a kid. But it's that soft bigotry of very specific expectations that I think brings us to today's conversation. And in many respects, who we are, how we are, where we are supposed to be, really shows up in a variety of ways in all contexts of human society and our social fabric. And there's a lot to celebrate, but there's a lot of cause for concern as well, which we're going to be talking about today. And I don't want to gloss over those celebrations. You know, certainly for this year alone, we had our first Asian American lead a Marvel superhero movie, which is a big deal and something I know that a lot of communities celebrated. Certainly just in the context of where we are, being in Washington, D.C., in the leadership of the cabinet, our first U.S. trade representative from the AAPI community, Vice President Harris from the AAPI community. The White House has, I think, we have representation from the administration today, but I think presidential personnel has north of at least 25 to 30% of AAPI representation across the administration. So a lot of significant wins kind of when we think of layers of our community. But let's be clear too, Asian Americans, we are faith leaders and shopkeepers. We're first responders and teachers. We're labor leaders and CEOs. We are literally in every single corner and fabric of society. And that has come from multi-generational investment in community and hard work and just each of our lived experience and narratives. But with that has come some pretty drastic realities as well. Despite where we're at when it comes to officials in the federal government, if you take a look at Asian American and Pacific Islander elected officials, we represent about less than 3% of the entire base of elected lawmakers across the country that's top and down the ballot. When we take a look at the last year, we have seen, or last few years rather, I should say, a significant pronouncement of Asian hate. A significant pronouncement and underfunding of recovery resources flowing in at the municipal and state level to Asian American owned businesses compared to other ethnically owned businesses. And we continue to have this conversation about how we can be both seeking or realizing incredible gains in different corners of our community, and yet still facing what feels like very primal setbacks when it comes to how we show up in our communities. I live in San Francisco, and I work for the ACLU. The team that I'm a deputy director on oversees a lot of our work around reproductive rights, housing rights, workers' rights, and trans rights. So I come to this conversation a little bit more as a citizen of my own Asian American community. But you would think that in a town like San Francisco, there is the most inclusive, embedded experience for Asian Americans, and there has been. Building that city and that community has been core to the AAPI experience. But yet, my own parents, as I was just mentioning outside, are a little nervous at visiting San Francisco these days, as there's this atmospheric of concern around crime and racism, and just having our Asian aunties and uncles walk across the street safely feels a little bit at risk. At the same time, we are a community and a nation that is investing in criminal justice reform, that wants to reimagine our police systems, that wants to invest in the types of programs that allow us to realize that we can both have racist legal systems that are not racist and that we can have Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders feel safe in their community. And unpacking how we do that at the local level, at the state or at the federal level, at the community level, and even at the international level is what we're going to be talking about today when we unpack where this experience is, why these tropes and stereotypes and these images exist, and why this hate continues to persist in our fabric today despite all of our gains. So with that, we're going to start with introductions. And I just want, as you're going through, maybe think about answering a macro question of how do we go about seizing this narrative today, a narrative that feels like we're being pulled in one direction with all the glories and the gains that we can applaud ourselves for, but also a narrative that feels like for all the investment and sweat equity and work, we haven't gotten farther enough. Tell us a little bit about yourselves, each of you, and tell us a little bit about how do we claim the narrative of the Asian American experience that you'd like to see today.
Thanks, Vikram. So I just want to introduce myself very briefly. My name is Cynthia Choi, and I'm the co-executive director of Chinese for Affirmative Action, and we're one of the founding partners of Stop API Hate. I think many may know that we're a coalition that really formed in the wake of attacks against our community. And but I wanted to just say a little bit about CAA because we've had a long history in this fight. We were founded over 50 years ago, based in San Francisco, but we've worked on issues related to racial equity since our founding, including the racial profiling of Chinese scientists to providing support for Lily Chin as she was seeking justice for her son. And I raised that because when we started the coalition with our partners, AAPI, Equity Alliance, and SF State University Asian American Studies, we started.
Hi, everyone. My name is Gisela Perez Kusakawa. I lead our anti-racial profiling work at Asian Americans Advancing Justice AAJC. Following the launch of the China Initiative by the Department of Justice, John C. Yang and I spearheaded a coalition to speak with the White House, with the Biden administration, and multiple federal agencies. And we were successfully able to end the China Initiative. That's not to say that there isn't more work to be done. That was one step forward, but certainly it was the culmination of years of work, including having impacted persons share their story. I want to share an anecdote because in the midst of all of the advocacy work to end the China Initiative, one reporter had asked me a question of why am I so personally invested in this? He told me he heard something in my voice and he asked, why do you care so much? And I think that was the first time a reporter had asked me. And I shared with him that my family came from a part in the Philippines where it was Tondo, Manila, where it was very easy and a normal part of life almost to have family members just die because they didn't have medicine. We were in the part of the city where folks were scared to come to. And that was really the world that I lived in. Coming to the United States for me was life-saving. And when I hear the stories of the scientists who fled China, who were there for Tiananmen Square, who were treated as refugees, who were persecuted based on their religion, they came to the United States with a lot of hope that many of us as immigrants face. And to hear them talk again and again about the pain that they feel, that this country where they held all of their dreams, there's nowhere else in the world that they can go to and be safe. To feel that they are scapegoated, that they are treated as some sort of threat to this country based on just where they came from. It is something that is so brutal for them and their families. And that is something that I really want to illustrate, that the reason we continue to fight is that there is hope in the American dream. There is hope that this is the country where people can find safety. And that's why we continue to do this work. But it's also very important to recognize that as Asian Americans and Asian immigrants, we continue to be subjected and re-traumatized by this cyclical pattern of scapegoating our communities as perpetual foreigners, as people that are disloyal to this country. And that is something that we shouldn't continue to have to face. We will fight each time that it happens, but there should be a recognition from the federal government. There should be a recognition in this country that that is not a burden that our community should be taking alone, and that this is a problem that the federal government and this country needs to face.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Lee. I'm a senior research fellow at a Washington, D.C.-based think tank called the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. I've been working in Washington for 15 years. I guess I'll start with a story since you were just so personal and poignant, and anything else I say after that will be very forgettable. I remember when I was on the House of Representatives as a foreign policy advisor, I was waiting for my security clearance, and it took longer than usual because I was born in South Korea. And I remember getting a lot of microaggression from colleagues saying like, well, why is yours taking so long? You know, like, what's up with that? Like, is something wrong with you? Like, are you a North Korean spy? I mean, it was just kind of ridiculous. And I just share that not because I'm like asking for your sympathy, but just to give you a glimpse of, you know, what it might be like to live through this period, as Cynthia and Gisela just said, that is very personally traumatic, but actually also being an advocate and having a voice to be in panels like this. It's an enormous privilege. But it's also, I feel, a strong burden because we are having to look at this issue through every angle every time we are speaking publicly about it, and it's very difficult. So I just want to acknowledge the tremendous work everyone is doing in this space because I can feel how tiring this is. I think for me, you know, I mean, Vikram's question is really difficult. You know, as a mom to an East Asian child, when I look at her, I just, you know, think about, well, when is that first conversation going to have to take place where I have to explain the kinds of microaggression and bullying she might face in this very, you know, emotionally difficult time where Americans have lost 1 million lives in this country. You know, and the fact that, you know, we continue to see rise in anti-Asian violence. You know, depressing polls after polls show that actually concerns about dual loyalty is only growing, not subsiding. So what is going on? You know, are we not speaking loudly enough? Are the right people not in the room demanding change? Like, what I genuinely want to know, because it seems like our community is doing our very best with the minimal resource that we have to, like you said, Vikram, change the narrative and show that brave face and say, like, actually, our community is going to be fine because we're resilient. We've been here a long time. We understand this landscape. We're coming together and we're fighting and we're speaking up. And I think actually that is, you know, to your point, Vikram, happening in many beautiful ways. But I do think that one of the things that we should be doing, you know, as people who are analysts, is to ask the hard questions of like, okay, well, let's look at the data, right? Let's look at what's happening. What has continued, you know, despite change in the administration? Why is that? You know, we should not be seeing, you know, increase in violence if the sole cause of anti-Asian violence was, you know, language emanating at the highest level of government. So apparently that is not the only root cause, right? So then we have to ask, you know, sharper questions. In my lens, as somebody who works in a think tank that promotes ending endless wars and promoting greater diplomacy, has been to look at the issue through the prism of U.S.-China relationship. You know, we believe it is our top one of our top priorities, you know, to really advocate for a more productive, positive sum bilateral relationship because planetary threats like climate change and pandemics require the two largest economies in the world to function together. And so, you know, through that lens, I've been speaking out on this issue because I see that by stoking xenophobia, you know, and anti-China hate, our community is really at the crossfire, and also it's hurting our ability to be seen, you know, globally as a pluralistic, tolerant country. So I do think all of these issues are very much intertwined, and I hope that we see more Asian Americans and others really, you know, connect the dots and you know, apply pressure where needed, and of course applaud, you know, when we see positive things happening.
I can assure you all three of those stories and reflections are much more powerful and memorable than one about the Power Rangers. So thank you for that. Vanessa?
Hi, good afternoon. My name's Vanessa Chen. I'm the Special Assistant to the President for Criminal Justice and Guns Policy in the Domestic Policy Council at the White House. I think to build upon the examples that other people have had, and I'm going to see if my neighbor will switch mics with me to get rid of this terrible feedback. Thank you. I figured, you were all even less likely to continue to listen if it had to be through feedback. But I think I just wanted to build upon the very personal examples that everybody on the panel has shared. I think to the point that Asian Americans are the perpetual foreigner, I think that has cut both ways, right? Because in many senses, we are lauded for the successes and the accomplishments that we've been able to achieve because you're the perpetual foreigner. You had to come, you had to establish yourself, you had to work so hard for this. But then on the other side is the sense of alienation, marginalization, and isolation. And we are all in a collective state of reckoning about that right now. And I think to the broader topic of this panel, which is how others view us and how we view ourselves and how we view the path forward, I think all of us here could list candidly a number of hate crimes against ourselves or loved ones, as well as hate incidents, anything from microaggressions to shunning, to comments that somebody means as innocuously as, no, where are you really from? Right? Or certainly for me, undertaking a career in the law, a lot of surprise from people that I wasn't going to take a transactional path, but rather the path of litigation and actually becoming a trial attorney in federal court, focusing on criminal cases. So I think a lot of that is layered on top of this collective pain and trauma that we all need to confront and work through. And somebody on the panel used the term resilience. And while I think that is an important term to use, it is also a term that puts a lot of the burden on the victim and the victim community, right? Because you are charged with being resilient. You are charged with drawing on your strength and resources to come back from that, when really the focus should be on how do we build capacity in the public sector, in the private sector, and in civil society to prevent, disrupt, deter these events from ever happening so you don't have to be resilient. And I'll close on that for now, but I'm looking forward to our conversation today. So thank you for having me.
As you all can tell, we have an incredible range of perspectives and insights here. I want to start with picking up on something that Cynthia and Gisela both spoke to, so you guys can take this from whatever direction you want. We're going to get to policy specifics in a second. Before we do, you both spoke about hope and how in a major way, our own personal stories, our family stories, if our future family stories will be rooted in hope of not just your own lived experience and what you want out of your own life, but hope of the American promise. And yet it does seem in a major way that the challenges and headwinds that we're facing is rooted in, as you said, Cynthia, a not so uncommon story of that promise being robbed of or taken away from a systemic racism perspective, but specific targets to the AAPI community. I know that my Sikh brothers and sisters face a fair amount of hate crimes in the past, for example. We know that we live in the United States with the stain of the Chinese Exclusion Act, with the stains of internment, and this modern stain of Japanese internment, and this modern stain of how we're thinking about our own neighbors showing up in communities. Before we dig into policy, just from a macro perspective, how do both of you see this sense of hope? And is there a way in which we should be thinking about dispelling these stereotypes and tropes and myths about who Asians are or aren't in order to reclaim some of that hope?
I think Gisela was a lot more hopeful than I was in my opening remarks, but I think for me, the hope comes from our community. And when I say our community, it's actually incredibly diverse. And this has been a moment where I think we've been able to come together because of the fact that this issue had affected so many of our communities, especially those in working class communities, those who were on the front lines, who didn't have a choice, like many of us, to stay home during the pandemic. I'm thinking about the delivery food drivers, the healthcare providers, the people who rely on public transportation and had to show up to work. And the conversations are happening at multiple levels. One is because there is more infrastructure, let's say, than when during the Vincent Chin murder. That was a really important time for our community because we rallied across the nation to support Willie Chin and the community. And of course, he wasn't the first person, nor was he the last person to be killed because of who he looked like. But it became this moment for our community where we said we had to really had to support Willie Chin during this time and to really call out that the trade war with Japan, the fact that we had car manufacturers and unions holding rallies, beating cars with baseball bats, it's not lost on us that he was then murdered by two people affected by the recession, killing him with the baseball bat. And it's the hopeful part for me is that we learn during every period of waves of anti-Asian racism. Just like in the post 9/11 period, I'm incredibly proud of the fact that, and so in awe of our AMEMSA leaders who came together in that moment to say, what do we actually need to address the immediate harm, but also hold our government accountable for the kinds of policies such as surveillance and other types of so-called anti-terrorist programs that actually harmed the AMEMSA community. And that work continues today. So I think for me, the hope really lies in the fact that our community is stronger, despite the fact that we have been harmed by the model minority myth, that there has been historic underinvestment by government, by philanthropy, by the private sector. And what I'm fearful of is that we don't galvanize and take this moment and convert it into a stronger movement that really relies on our own strength and capacity. We can't wait for anyone else to take action, and we need to be, really speak out in terms of government and state-sponsored discrimination and racial profiling, and also build capacity at the very local level. What happened in Dallas and Buffalo, Laguna Woods, it's going to take a lot to recover, to really make people feel like they can actually attend church or go grocery shopping or go get their hair done, or to go to Asian corridors, the Chinatowns, the Manila towns, etc. And so for me, the hope is also on the conversations that we're having of what's really going to make us safe, what are the kinds of investments. And that really is about making sure that people's basic needs are being met. I don't see policing as the answer. I don't see federal policies, unless they really focus investments in local communities, really addressing these issues. And unless we address the fact that anti-China policies and rhetoric is really one of the major drivers, including white supremacy being normalized and also weaponized to attack our communities. I don't think that was very hopeful.
No.
Sorry.
It's important to contrast it. Maybe you could take that, but also through your work, maybe speak to some of the tools that you think in celebrating both the hope, but also acknowledging the grievances and the tragedies we confront. What the anti-profiling work, how to combat some of that looks like from your vantage point.
Yeah, and I think on my side of the work, it's more of a sliver of hope. And yet, as many have said, our communities are so resilient. I'll give an example. Professor Gang Chen is an MIT professor, and he has probably one of the most prominent Chinese scientist that was indicted under the China Initiative. He did absolutely nothing wrong. And yet for years, he lived in fear. His family was scared. They didn't understand why the federal government had specifically targeted him. His indictment had actually led to a massive movement across the academic community because they had seen in Professor Gang Chen not just him as an individual, but they saw themselves in him. And so a huge slogan of that movement was, "We are all Gang Chen." And there was this revitalized. Before that, you hadn't seen Asian American scientists and academics be so politically active. But seeing this happen to someone who they so much respected, to someone who did absolutely nothing wrong, gave folks this energy to fight back and galvanize. And when I speak to Professor Gang Chen, it's incredible to hear him say that after those 2 years where he had experienced so much trauma, so much fear, not knowing if he would be put in prison, right? This is one of the crucial parts. Many of these folks could be imprisoned for years for not having done anything wrong. He continues to say to the public, to folks in the government, "I am here. I can help. I want to make America better." The fact that he has that sort of continued energy to fight, I think, is indicative of the type of hope that we have. But it really shouldn't be something that he has to bear. It shouldn't be something that our communities have to take on. And also recognizing that many couldn't take on that burden. We hear of stories of scientists who leave the country where they are scared, they're frightened. They had seen this happen to them before in an oppressive regime. To see it happen to them in the United States is just something that was very traumatizing for many of these communities. We hear of stories who've lost their homes. They've had to sell their children's furniture to even afford to continue to go and litigate. Knowing that you are just here trying to live your life, advance science in the United States, but you have this tremendous government who somehow looks at you with suspicion, who thinks that you could be a threat to them, it really is something that is very disheartening. So as much as we have this sense of hope, this fighting spirit, I also want to say it's not true for everyone. This has crushed many people's dreams. It's crushed many people's lives. And there are many more in the shadows who are silent, who can't talk about it. There are those who tell me they can't even talk about the persecution they experienced in China. They're stuck. They are silenced in every way in their life. And so knowing that makes it so much more important for us as advocates to continue the work with folks like Professor Gang Chen. But we really shouldn't have this full burden on our communities.
I think that's completely fair. And I want to shift a little bit more into what we can do to start remedying some of these challenges. And you're right, we shouldn't hang our hat on false hope if there isn't much to be claimed there. But you all have spoken to this in different ways, but there are a lot of nudges that we can, or a lot of different levers we should think through when it comes to federal action, when it comes to hate crime reporting, when it comes to foreign policy, and when it comes to just the narratives within our communities. But I suspect that even though you all will have views on them, there are some challenges within that, right? Cynthia spoke to, and we'll start with you, Vanessa, just to make sure that we're looking at kind of the macro lens from a White House or administration perspective. But Cynthia mentioned that there's a distinction between hate crimes and hate incidences, right? So not only is there underreporting of what's going on, but when we're reporting, how we navigate what is legally in one camp or another can be an issue. It was also mentioned that basic needs of communities might be fueling crime when it comes to access to housing or access to affordable medicine or just being able to get a small business loan if you're an Asian American American small business owner. There's also foreign policy considerations. There's also actions that have been taken by the U.S. Department of Justice in recent years, but some of that maybe hasn't gone far enough, or maybe it's exactly we need a little bit more time for it to play out. So there's going to be a little bit of a dial as opposed to a switch and getting the perfect recipe for all of these policy investments right now. But I'd love to hear from each of you as to where you think these emphases should be, and specifically just to give us a macro landscape from a federal perch. Can you speak to what's been going on from a executive branch and administration perspective?
Absolutely. I would be glad to. And I'm going to attempt to literally read the room for when you start glazing over on this. And then I can always pause and come back. But I think when we speak about the statistics about hate crimes and hate incidents, we know that they are dramatically underreported. And so with that context in mind, when we look at data across the 12 most populous cities in the United States in 2021, hate crimes in general, and again, this is just hate crimes, not hate incidents, rose 11%. But against Asian Americans, it rose 339% from 2020 to 2021. And of course, 2020 itself was a significant increase from 2019. And so with that as the context, there are a few things that I'd like to just set the table on. On President Biden's first day in office, he directed all federal agencies, federal executive agencies, to identify ways to combat anti-Asian hate, discrimination, and xenophobia. Of course, that work continues. He also signed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which dramatically increased the resources, the guidance, the training available to federal, state, and local law enforcement for prevention, disruption, deterrence, and enforcement. That act also established a hate crimes coordinator at DOJ to work across all of the components at DOJ to really ensure that DOJ was really bringing all of its resources to bear in prevention, investigation, and enforcement. But I also think that what is critical and what was so meaningful to me, not just as a member of the administration, but also in my identity as an Asian American woman, was that for the first time, the White House established a deputy level person in the administration who sits in the Chief of Staff office, who is the liaison for all AANHPI activities. It also reinvigorated the White House initiative on, also known as WWII, which is studying a number of reforms that the whole of the federal government can take. It also established the President's Advisory Commission, which is comprised of members from civil society, community leaders, business leaders, and the like, to really bring to bear their expertise and perspective. But I think that when we talk about the federal response and we talk about the challenges that our communities have encountered, they are also opportunities for reform. They are opportunities for us to deliver. And at the risk of being the person who quotes Hamilton, for so long, we have not been in the room where it happens. And I think that what this administration, going back to your earlier point about hope, we have a vice president who is Asian. We have a number of cabinet level secretaries and officials who run agencies and components who are Asian. Among all White House staff, 17% identify as Asian, but among commissioned officers, such as myself, who are more senior staff, that number increases to 26%. And that's to say nothing of the representation at all of the federal agencies. That's to say nothing of the historic number of nominations and confirmations to the federal bench, which is a lifetime tenure position. And I can't help but reflect in my time as a law student when we read cases like Korematsu and Yikuo, you wonder, would that have been different if there were Asian Americans who were litigating the case, who were on the bench? And we don't know, but I think when we talk about hope, that is progress, and those are hard metrics that I find encouraging, but I also want to make sure that I don't diminish the need for us to continue to push forward. And I think what I find heartening is where I sit in the Domestic Policy Council, each and every one of our work streams, whether it's education, labor, criminal justice, embedded in that is a reflection of the need to deliver on President Biden's direction from day one to address xenophobia, bias, and discrimination, because again, hate crimes is a subset of that, but the problem is much broader.
The problem is a lot broader, and just to kind of stick with this idea of where these causes are coming from, I want to go to you. I mean, you spoke very thoughtfully in terms of, someone that's worked on the Hill and now at a think tank, how you see what is taking root here from various vantage points, some very small and personal in our daily lives, some on the platform of the world stage. Talk to us a little bit about the geopolitics at play right now. You mentioned the relationship between the U.S. and China, and like how tight that is bilaterally, or even how tense it can be bilaterally, might have trickle-down effects from both a foreign policy perspective, but also a perception perspective of the Asian American experience, maybe the Chinese American experience here. What does foreign policy's role have to mean when it comes to incidences of hate or reclaiming that hopeful narrative we would want from our community?
Sure. Thank you for that. And, I think what I'll start with is, I've actually, before this job as a foreign policy analyst, I was a community organizer with the Korean American community for 4 years. And this was during the Trump kind of fire and fury rhetoric, preventive war with North Korea kind of language that was proliferating. And I remember getting an interview request from a Washington, D.C. news outlet saying, what does the Korean American community think about this potential war with North Korea? And I remember feeling really uncomfortable because I was not really get used to being a public voice, but was sort of thrown into this limelight and became de facto kind of spokesperson for my organization. And by extension, the community that I represented. And so it was an interesting turn of events to now be here, because I see and I recognize and I empathize with the urge among Asian Americans to shy away from national security issues. I understand why, because I've talked to many people who told me why. It's not very difficult to understand. It's very simple. It's what everybody said. There's this perception that somehow we're not American enough. So why in the world would you start talking about North Korea or China and invite, ridicule and potentially career-damaging accusations? So I understand perfectly well, this desire to be silent. But in this think tank, I, again, have really felt compelled to speak up. And I'll, in the interest of time, I'll just hit 3 problems and then go to solutions, which is, I think, what you're looking for. So I've been writing about this intersection of anti-Asian violence and foreign policy since May 2020. And I think there are essentially 3 problems, at least, that I've identified. Number one is that the xenophobic, hyperbolic language about China kind of taking over the United States or being this existential threat of America is obviously stoking anxiety and fear among Americans who are experiencing tremendous loss and are frustrated with the pandemic. And what is happening from a foreign policy lens is that it actually undermines our global image as a tolerant country, as I said at the top. Number 2, the constant demonization of China, I think, has a cumulative effect on public opinion. As Cynthia and others said, a recent poll showed that Americans continue to wrongly blame Asian Americans for the COVID pandemic, and their distrust for Asian Americans and potential concerns about dual loyalty has grown. So how this affects Asian American national security professionals and others, I think, is really something we need to contend with. The third problem that I see from foreign policy lens is that resources are getting diverted to the military and the defense realm in the name of combating this existential threat that is China. So just to give you one example, there's too many to cite because there are hundreds of bills before the Congress, and we don't have time to get into any of them. But one amendment in this must-pass China technology bill that the Senate approved is an $8 billion diversion from Green Climate Fund to DARPA. to research weapons development to compete with China. So that just gives you a taste of what we're talking about. So in terms of solutions, I think there are, first of all, we have to recognize there are legitimate concerns that I think China poses to the United States, government-backed industrial espionage, IP theft, disinformation campaign, human rights violation, et cetera. And I think there are smart, nuanced ways to address these issues without stoking xenophobia and fear nationwide. The solution I think here is part of it is just research. We need more good analysis that links, as Gisela said, the history of how this is sort of a pattern where minority rights come under attack in intense periods of geopolitical tension. One scholar that is affiliated with the Quincy Institute, Robert Ralston, he conducted a survey and his paper is forthcoming, and it showed that respondents exposed to language that shows U.S. is in decline were much more likely to express anti-Asian hate and anti-Asian sentiments compared to those in the control group. So I think we need more research like that. And I think finally, we need to avoid language like malign influence, these sweeping terms that somehow the CCP or China is in everywhere, ubiquitous, and that we are all being subjected to it. That kind of careless language will literally kill lives. And we need to call out politicians and policymakers and anyone else with a loud microphone that perpetuates those kinds of harmful language and stereotypes. Thanks.
I mean, that's a fascinating take. I think taking a look at how we interact with other countries, it feels both unique for this moment, but as you also concluded, not unique to the history of the United States. But I'd love you all to jump in here. I mean, this is obviously very difficult and can be approached from a lot of different vantage points. But maybe, so Cynthia, we'll kick it over to you to start, and anyone please jump in. It does feel that a lot of these topics, they're not just national in scope. They're not just being debated here in Washington, D.C. at think tanks or in the federal government or in the White House. They're playing out in our cities, in our homes, in our neighborhoods. And in a big way that they're playing out is this tension between, in a post-George Floyd America, how we think about community safety, how we think about public safety, how we reimagine policing in this country, while also a very huge need to ensure that our families can feel safe walking their streets. How do we make sure that we're hitting that right balance between kind of goals of criminal justice reform and safety in the streets? And what are we missing that maybe has been absent from this conversation thus far?
So I'm really, really happy right now because usually I'm like the only person talking about the connections with policy, U.S. foreign policy, and so I'm extremely happy. So I think why it's important to have a deeper understanding of root causes is it goes directly to the solutions. So if we merely see this as some unique chapter in our history where Asians are being attacked and we don't understand that these persistent racial stereotypes painting us as national security threats or public health threats, that it doesn't have historical roots, then of course we're going to focus on law enforcement approaches. Let's catch the individuals who either have access to guns or are pointing to mental illness as the solution. And I think if we don't have a deeper understanding of what are the conditions, the fact that the Great Replacement theory is actually just recycled conspiracy theories that have existed since our arrival here. That the only difference now is that it's been mainstreamed. The only difference now is that there's absolutely no accountability. And in fact, it has become part of the playbook of how you actually win campaigns. If we don't get to those answers or get to those issues and what those drivers are, we will continue to see our community under attack. So I think all of us here on the panel, I think we have very different areas of work, but I think we can all agree that we do have to respond to harm that's happening in our community. And that has to, again, as I've said before, we do need to build local responses in San Francisco, New York, Dallas, everywhere, that really does respond to the fact that people don't feel safe leaving their homes. And what does that actually look like? one, we need to have everyone in those local communities, including elected officials, faith leaders, and community organizations coming together to support the victims and their surviving family members and communities. And I think there needs to be a place where we talk about the long-term healing that needs to happen. I think there also needs to be conversations about the preventative work and especially the cross-solidarity work. We can't ignore the racial tensions that exist within our communities. That's not going to help us at all, because they do exist, and they do especially look pretty egregious when we look at communities that are struggling. So I think this is where I'd like to point to, in addition to the fact that we can't ignore the anti-China rhetoric. This is really something that we're seeing in our data every day, when people are being told to go back to China, you're the reasons why this pandemic occurred in the first place. So they're directly connected, and I think that the more that we hold everyone accountable, regardless of their political affiliation, the better we'll see results.
And I just wanted to add to what Cynthia mentioned, because this is such a crucial part. I wanted to share a quote from Fred T. Korematsu that unfortunately is still relevant today. So he had mentioned, no one should ever be locked away simply because they share the same race, ethnicity, or religion as a spy or terrorist. If that principle was not learned from the internment of Japanese Americans, then these are very dangerous times for our democracy. We often forget that post-World War II, there was a rationale from the federal government and why they wanted to incarcerate people of Japanese descent across the country. They thought the people of Japanese descent are more prone to activities of sabotage, that they're more prone to economic espionage. And unfortunately, this hasn't changed. The rationale that somehow this makes our country safer. We see this in the scapegoating post 9/11 for AMEMSA, Arab, Middle Eastern, South Asian, and Muslim communities. And we see it right now happening to Chinese Americans or people who are perceived to be of Chinese descent across the country. The China Initiative was launched in 2018. Many years after Japanese incarceration. And unfortunately, the premise is still there. The racial bias is still there. There's this theory that continues to circulate of non-traditional collectors. This means that you don't need to intend to be a spy. You could be someone who was a family member, a loved one in China. You could be forced to spy. You could unintentionally spy. These sort of broad statements really just mean that if you're of Chinese descent, you're under suspicion of being a spy. This has led to people being prolonged detained. This has led to people being put in very difficult situations with their family. And it only just ended this past year. It only just ended this past year. So the reality is that our communities are always going to be impacted when there are rising U.S. tensions with an Asian country because there's too much racism. We are not going to be treated in the same way that other communities are going to be treated. And so because of that, we need to think about long-term solutions. Of course, we need to work with the families that are impacted right now, work with a lot of the cases that are happening. But we should ask ourselves, what is the American national security apparatus? And why is it so tied to our identities? It's not tied to the national security concern. It's tied to the fact that we have connections abroad, and that is always going to disproportionately impact Asian Americans. We are a predominantly immigrant community. I mean, how many people here immigrated to the United States? The fact that our national security clearances can be impacted, our work can be impacted, that we could somehow go to prison because we have a connection abroad. This continues to be a problem in 2022. And so unless we fix that, it's going to be an issue in the future with any new country.
Vanessa, you want to jump in?
Thank you. I just wanted to make sure that I addressed the public safety component of your question. The portfolio I hold at the Domestic Policy Council is criminal justice and guns. And I think what you have seen in President Biden's budget the fiscal year 22 appropriation from Congress, as well as the fiscal year 23 request, as well as the priorities in the various federal agencies such as DOJ, DHS, the Department of Education, is really that focus on building capacity, whether that's in schools, whether it's through American Rescue Plan funds to provide to AANHPI communities who were suffering economic loss due to boycotts of their businesses, to AANHPI children who were being harassed, bullied, discriminated against in schools. But it's also a reimagining of the relationship between law enforcement and the communities they are sworn to serve, right? It's delivering culturally competent training, which is much more than just language access. It's understanding that in many of our communities, to the point that you just raised, because they may be immigrant-based, there may be a fear of reporting even when someone is a victim of a crime due to concerns that law enforcement will notify immigration officials. And I think to that point, it's especially noteworthy that the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security issued a directive specifically regarding victims who may not have immigrant status here in the United States, out of an awareness that that was chilling reporting rates and chilling the ability of agencies to provide the necessary services, whether it's immediate trauma-informed services for the individual or longer-term healing support for communities to develop that capacity. But I think that that work has been critical. It's been critical that Congress has funded it, but of course, there's so much more work that needs to be done. And just wanted to thank you all for your leadership and your advocacy.
Absolutely. And I think as we wrap, would welcome just parting thoughts from each of you. But what you can tell here is that certainly these aren't issues that we unpack in 1 hour alone, or even in a single administration alone. And it does take this set of layers from civil liberties advocates to civil rights advocates to community organizing to state government to federal government to foreign policy. So it's a tremendous body of work on display here today that we haven't even been able to scratch the surface on, but I want to thank you all for your respective leadership. And maybe we start with you in terms of
be brief since we're already out of time. Well, I think this has been such a great conversation. Thank you so much to Vanessa in particular, coming out here, being so thoughtful and listening to our concerns. My only regret is that there wasn't an NSC counterpart to Vanessa here to listen to what was already addressed in terms of the foreign policy implication of this crisis of anti-Asian racism, because it is not just a domestic issue. It has foreign policy implications, as I made very clear. And I hope that we can continue to learn and support each other in this very fraught and difficult moment.
Does
in our
Quincy,
community.
does your think tank have any forthcoming reports on the topic?
Yes, check out our website, and happy to talk to you more about our paper that's forthcoming on this topic, which will be prominently placed in our website.
Awesome. Giselle?
I think my biggest thing is, really be engaged and be involved. Don't shy away when civil rights issues are intersected with some sort of national security context, because that's one way to really make our communities not be involved. When I first started this work, I would see something on a news article and it just copied and pasted things from the Department of Justice webpage. And so we have to remain smart. We really need to remain critical. And at the end of the day, this makes it a better country for everyone. I don't know how many times folks were thankful because we broke down and analyzed a really complicated issue so that the community could be involved and also federal agency staffers could be involved, because a lot of times these cases are challenging and they're complicated. But that is the type of way that our communities gets targeted. And so we really need to make sure we're always engaged regardless.
Cynthia?
I see that they're getting anxious to clear out the room. Well, I think this panel really does reflect the fact that we need people inside government, we need think tanks, and we need advocacy groups speaking truth to power. And I think, sadly, our forecast is this isn't going away. This is going to continue to be an issue, especially as U.S.-China relations continues to worsen. And the fact that I think again, I'm going to acknowledge TAF here, recently did a poll that, a significant portion of the US population believes that Asians are in part to blame. We just passed the 1 million mark of lost lives. In my opinion, it didn't have to be that way. I think we have to really pay attention to the role of misinformation and disinformation and really make sure that we continue to connect the dots. As long as we focus just on the interpersonal aspects of it, we're not going to be able to move the dial.
And I know we got to go, but Vanessa, you want to close this out?
As I would often say in court, I will rest upon my prior pleadings.
Great.
And thank you all.
Great. Well said. Well, like a true attorney. Thank you all so much for sticking out this conversation. This is obviously not going anywhere, so really appreciate each of your respective contributions to the body of work, and probably several more in this room today. So thank you.